The Appalachian Trail, 2,197.4 miles of wilderness, stretching from Springer Mountain, Georgia, to Mount Katahdin, Maine. For decades, it has called to adventurers, dreamers, and those seeking something beyond the noise of modern life. Each year, more than 3 million people walk portions of its ancient paths. Some are seeking solitude and others, transformation. But the trail holds secrets in its shadows. Dark stories that hikers whisper around campfires, warnings passed from one wanderer to the next. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and today's episode is a bit different than usual, but not too unfamiliar. Remember the episodes I did about Yellowstone mysteries and that one about missing person cases? Yeah, this is something like that. Today we're talking about actual, real-life cases of unexplained murders and disappearances on the Appalachian Trail. What makes them unexplained? Well, some of these cases involve extremely strange deaths, with no killer ever found. And for those cases where the killer is found, their motive is never understood or explained. And for those disappearances, well, we'll just never know. Because the following disappearances in today's episode are unsolved. Which of these do you think is scarier? If you like this style of episode, let me know about cases you'd love me to cover. And if you have scary unexplained stories of your own, send them to me at darkstories.org. As always, like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. Follow and rate Unexplained Encounters if you're on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. Now, let's begin. Case 1. The Appalachian Trail Killer. The Curse of Dismal Creek. They called it the Wapiti Shelter, a simple three-sided structure along Dismal Creek in the mountains of Giles County, Virginia. For thru-hikers on the Appalachian Trail, it was supposed to be a refuge, a place to rest weary legs. But in the spring of 1981, this shelter became the scene of the first double homicide in the Appalachian Trail's history. And even more disturbing, it would not be the last time blood was spilled at this exact location. Robert Mountford Jr. and Laura Susan Ramsey were both 27-year-old social workers from Maine with their whole lives ahead of them. Friends called Laura Susu, and those who knew them described the pair as kind, compassionate, and eager to make a difference in the world. They weren't just hiking for recreation or personal challenge. Robert and Laura were hiking the Appalachian Trail to raise money for a school for mentally challenged children in Maine, a school run by Robert's mother. On May 19, 1981, Robert and Laura arrived at the Wapiti Shelter after a long day of hiking. The evening air was cool, and the forest around them was alive with the sounds of spring. However, they weren't alone at the shelter that night. Another man was there, a local named Randall Lee Smith. Smith was 27 years old, the same age as his victims. He lived in nearby Parisburg, Virginia, a small mountain town of only a few thousand people. Those who knew him described Randall as a loner, a man who spent most of his time hunting and fishing in the woods. He had no friends in high school, no girlfriend, and no real connections to speak of. He was known for telling outlandish lies, stories so transparent that no one believed them. His neighbors had given him a cruel but fitting nickname, Lying Randall, sometimes shortened to just LR. Earlier that day, Robert and Laura had stopped at a grocery store near the trail, and that's where they first encountered Smith. He struck up a conversation with them, and later that evening, he appeared at the Wapiti Shelter, where they decided to camp for the night. What happened next would haunt the Appalachian Trail community for decades. According to evidence gathered by investigators, Smith shared a meal with Robert and Laura that evening. They likely had no reason to suspect danger. The culture of the trail is built on camaraderie and trust. Hikers often share food and stories and shelter space with strangers. But as soon as the meal ended, Smith revealed his true intentions. He attacked both of them brutally. Robert Mountford Jr. was shot in the head with a .22 caliber pistol while he slept. Laura Ramsey fought for her life. She was struck in the head with a piece of iron, then stabbed repeatedly with a knife and a long nail. Forensic evidence would later show she had defensive wounds on her hands, proof she had fought back desperately against her attacker. Investigators believed she may have been sexually assaulted before her murder, though Smith never admitted to this. After killing both of them, Smith dragged their bodies away from the shelter and placed them inside their sleeping bags. He then buried them in shallow graves covered with leaves and debris, hoping to conceal his crimes. Then he began methodically covering his tracks. He traveled to multiple shelters along the trail, removing pages from the logbooks where Robert and Laura had signed their names. He stole items from their belongings and took them back to his home. But Randall Lee Smith wasn't as clever as he thought. When Robert and Laura were reported missing, witnesses came forward. Other hikers had seen Smith with the couple shortly before they disappeared. Some recalled him telling them that he knew what had happened to the missing hikers, a chilling statement that immediately drew suspicion. When a cadaver dog finally located the bodies nearly 2 weeks after the murders, investigators found a critical piece of evidence: a bloody fingerprint inside of one of Laura's paperback novels. And that fingerprint belonged to Randall Lee Smith. A search of Smith's home turned up even more damning evidence: blood-soaked blue jeans belonging to the victims, items stolen from their packs, and a bizarre handwritten note claiming that Smith had been abducted by 2 people who were going to kill him, an obvious attempt to create an alibi. Smith fled to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where he abandoned his truck with another strange note stuffed in the ashtray. The note read, "This boy and girl had been so nice to me. It's going to be a real shame when the time comes to get rid of them." Police tracked him down and tricked him into revealing his identity by telling him the bug bites on his arms were serious and required medical attention. When he signed the medical forms, they had him. Back in Virginia, Smith initially claimed amnesia, insisting he didn't know who he was or why he was in South Carolina. But he soon stopped talking altogether, refusing to discuss the murders. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, prosecutors were worried. They could not establish a clear motive, and they feared the case might not guarantee a conviction. After consulting with the victims' families, they offered Smith a plea bargain. On the day before his trial was set to begin, Randall Lee Smith pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, 2 concurrent 15-year terms. The sentencing sparked outrage. Members of the hiking community protested outside the courthouse. Law enforcement officials were furious. A spokesman for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, then called the Appalachian Trail Conference, stated that Smith was the first person convicted of murdering a hiker who has had or will have an opportunity to leave prison. The local district attorney election was directly affected by the controversy. But the most disturbing part of the story was yet to come. In 1996, after serving just 15 years of his 30-year sentence, Randall Lee Smith was released on mandatory parole for good behavior. He returned to Pearisburg and moved back in with his mother, Loretta Smith, into the same small run-down house where he had grown up. Loretta told reporters she was excited to have her son home. She had visited him only once during his entire 15 years in prison. Smith's return to the community was met with a mixture of fear and denial. Some neighbors later admitted they believed he would eventually commit another violent crime. But most people simply tried to ignore his presence. He remained a loner, wandering the woods and the trail he had once stained with blood. His nickname, Lying Randall, followed him, and people sometimes called him that to his face. For 12 years, Smith lived quietly in Pearisburg. Quietly, but not innocently. In early May 2008, neighbors noticed they had not seen Randall Lee Smith for several days. His utilities had been shut off for non-payment, and people began to worry, or rather were curious about, his welfare. Some assumed he'd simply gone off into the woods along the Appalachian Trail. It was something he did often, But when he didn't return, the neighbors organized search parties and hung missing person posters in town and along the trail. Randall Lee Smith wasn't missing, though. He was hunting. On May 6, 2008, two friends, Sean Farmer, a 33-year-old coal truck driver, and Scott Johnston, a 38-year-old ceramic tile layer, went on a fishing trip at Dismal Creek, near the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. They were lifelong friends from Bluefield, Virginia, and they had fished this area many times before. They had no idea they were about to become the latest victims of the Appalachian Trail killer. That afternoon, while Scott Johnston was fishing alone, a gaunt, frail-looking man with a white beard approached him. The stranger was wearing expensive camouflage clothing and new hiking boots, despite appearing as though he'd been living in the woods. He introduced himself as Ricky Williams and asked if he could fish alongside Scott. The two spent hours fishing together, reportedly catching a lot of trout. That evening, the man who called himself Ricky Williams appeared at the campsite where Scott and Sean had set up camp. He was accompanied by a dog, claiming he had recently found the animal. Sean and Scott, being friendly and generous as hikers often are, invited the stranger to join them for dinner. They shared their food and conversation as darkness fell over the woods. The stranger hung around long after dinner ended, even though he claimed his own camp was over an hour away. At 8:30 p.m., he finally announced he was leaving. Sean and Scott relaxed, probably relieved to have their campsite to themselves again. Then, without warning or provocation, Randall Lee Smith pulled out a .22 caliber revolver and began shooting. He shot Sean Farmer twice. He shot Scott Johnston twice. The attack was sudden, brutal, and without mercy, just like the murders he had committed 27 years earlier in almost the exact same location. This was Dismal Creek. This was near the Wapiti shelter. History was repeating itself, and Smith had returned to the scene of his original crimes. But this time, something went wrong, at least for Smith. Despite their serious injuries, both Sean and Scott survived. In a remarkable display of sheer will, the two wounded men managed to escape. They climbed into Smith's truck and drove 40 miles to the nearest hospital. Sean had been shot in the head and shoulder, and Scott's injuries were also severe, but they both lived. Meanwhile, Smith fled the scene in Scott Johnston's Ford Ranger pickup truck. He was spotted by a Virginia state trooper, which led to a high-speed chase through the mountain roads. Smith crashed and overturned the truck during the pursuit. He was pulled from the wreckage and arrested at the scene, charged with 2 counts of attempted murder. While being treated for injuries sustained in the crash, Smith was transferred to the medical wing of the New River Regional Jail. In a strange twist of fate, the assistant superintendent of that jail had once been a member of the investigative team that discovered Robert Mountford's and Laura Ramsey's bodies in 1981. He had also been the first officer to respond when Smith was arrested in Myrtle Beach. Now, nearly 3 decades later, he was overseeing Smith's detention for nearly identical crimes. Smith tried to claim he had shot Farmer and Johnston in self-defense, but no one believed him. On the evening of May 10, 2008, just 4 days after the shooting, Randall Lee Smith was found unconscious in his cell. Despite attempts to revive him, he died at the age of 54. An autopsy ruled the cause of death as a blood clot related to his injuries from the truck crash. The Appalachian Trail killer was finally dead, but questions remained. Some investigators believe Smith may have killed others during the 12 years between his release from prison and his 2008 attack. When police searched the area where he had been hiding before the shooting, they found a disturbing cache of items: his GED certificate obtained in prison, his birth certificate, a police scanner, law enforcement radio codes, and a plastic topographical map with multiple locations marked in pencil. Most unsettling of all was a cassette tape that police described as containing some kind of satanic ritual. They also never found the murder weapon from 1981. The .22 revolver Smith used in 2008 was traced to a sale that occurred in June 1981, just weeks after Robert and Laura were killed. Records showed it was common for gun dealers at the time to wait months before filing official paperwork. It's entirely possible that Smith purchased that same gun in April or May 1981 and used it to murder Robert Mountford Jr. But because the original evidence was long gone, this could never be proven. Why did Randall Lee Smith kill? What drove him to commit such horrific violence not once but twice at nearly the same location on the Appalachian Trail? Various theories have emerged over the decades. Some believe Smith became romantically obsessed with Laura Ramsey after she was friendly to him at the grocery store, and he killed her and Robert in a jealous rage. A 1985 book about the murders suggested Smith was delusional and living out violent fantasies due to a troubled childhood. Another theory proposed that Robert and Laura, as social workers, recognized Smith's psychological issues and were trying to help him, but they provoked his anger instead. One chilling theory suggests Smith believed the Appalachian Trail belonged to him. He saw other hikers as interlopers, intruders on his territory, and he felt justified in killing them. Whatever his motivation, Randall Lee Smith left a permanent scar on the Appalachian Trail. The Wapiti Shelter, once a peaceful refuge for tired hikers, became synonymous with violence and death. To this day, hikers who pass through that section of the trail report an overwhelming sense of unease. The U.S. Forest Service closed the road leading to the Wapiti Shelter after the 1981 murders, turning what used to be a short walk into a 2-mile trek. But that didn't stop the killer from returning. Today, Sean Farmer and Scott Johnston are still alive, living testaments to both the randomness of evil and the strength of the human spirit. Despite their traumatic experience, both men have returned to Dismal Creek to fish. They refuse to let Randall Lee Smith's evil take away the place they love. Case 2. The Unsolved Murder of Louise Chaput. November in the White Mountains of New Hampshire is a study in contrasts. The fall foliage has faded, leaving skeletal trees against gray skies. The air carries a sharp bite, a warning that winter is coming. But for experienced hikers, this is a beautiful time to explore, with fewer crowds and peaceful trails. Louise Chaput loved the White Mountains. The 52-year-old psychologist from Sherbrooke, Quebec, had hiked the region many times before. She knew the trails, understood the risks, and never let fear keep her from doing what she loved. In November 2001, she was planning another hiking trip with friends, a group of women who shared her passion for the outdoors. But when those plans fell through after the recent events of September 11th, Louise made a decision that would ultimately cost her her life. She decided to go alone. On Thursday morning, November 15th, 2001, Louise packed her hiking gear into her silver Ford Focus station wagon. She said goodbye to her longtime boyfriend and her 2 daughters. Louise told them she would be gone for 3 days, hiking around Mount Washington and staying at the Joe Dodge Lodge at the Appalachian Mountain Club's Pinkham Notch Visitor Center. She would be back by Monday evening, November 19th. Louise's daughters would later remember their mother as an active, vibrant woman who lived by a simple philosophy. You have to earn your dinner. You have to do something. She was sociable, friendly, generous to a fault, and deeply passionate about the outdoors. Her friend, Denise Masson, recalled, "She thought the White Mountains were beautiful. She liked it there." Louise crossed from Canada into the United States at Norton, Vermont at 11:45 a.m. Security cameras and border records confirmed the exact time. About an hour later, she stopped for gas at a convenience store in Colebrook, New Hampshire. A credit card receipt found in her car would later place her at that exact location. Then she continued south toward Pinkham Notch. She arrived at approximately 3 p.m., just as daylight was beginning to fade. The Pinkham Notch Visitor Center sits in a dramatic location. nestled in the valley beneath Mount Washington, the highest peak in the northeastern United States at 6,288 feet. The area is renowned for its unpredictable and often deadly weather. But Louise wasn't planning to summit Mount Washington that afternoon. She had a reservation at the Joe Dodge Lodge for the night and planned to do her serious hiking over the next 2 days. Before checking in, Louise stopped at the visitor center and asked an Appalachian Mountain Club employee for a recommendation. She explained that she had been driving for many hours and wanted to do a short, easy hike before dark, just enough to stretch her legs and earn her dinner. The employee, noticing her French accent, suggested the Lost Pond Trail, which began just across the street from the lodge. It was a simple loop, perfect for someone who had been sitting in a car all day. Louise thanked him, walked out the door, and headed toward the trailhead. She was never seen alive again. The clerk at the Joe Dodge Lodge waited for Louise to check in that evening. She never arrived. Her reserved room sat empty. But solo hikers sometimes change their plans, and the staff had no reason to panic. Not yet. Louise's boyfriend and daughters expected her home by the evening of November 19th. When she didn't return and didn't call, they grew concerned. By November 20th, they were terrified. They contacted authorities and reported her missing. Her silver Ford Focus was found parked at a trailhead near the Pinkham Notch area. Inside the car, investigators found the credit card receipt from the Colebrook convenience store. But Louise and her hiking gear were nowhere to be found. For 3 days, search teams fought brutal conditions to look for Louise Chaput. Temperatures had dropped dangerously low, and deep snow made the search treacherous. Dozens of volunteers combed the trails around Mount Washington, desperately hoping to find her alive, perhaps injured or lost. The White Mountains are notoriously dangerous. Hikers have died from exposure, falls, and sudden weather changes. Everyone hoped this was a rescue mission, but it wasn't. On November 22, 2001, 3 days after Louise was reported missing, hikers made a horrific discovery along the Glen Boulder Trail, about 200 feet off the main path. They found Louise Chaput's body, partially concealed in the woods. She was wearing black fleece pants, a red nylon jacket, and white Reebok sneakers, casual clothing that confirmed she had only planned a short hike when she set out from the visitor center. She hadn't died from exposure or a fall. She hadn't succumbed to the elements or gotten lost in the wilderness. No, Louise Chaput had been murdered. The medical examiner's report revealed the brutal truth. Louise had been stabbed multiple times. The attack had occurred in the afternoon hours of November 15th, the same day she arrived at Pinkham Notch, possibly during or just after her short hike. Evidence at the scene indicated she had fought back against her attacker. There were signs of a struggle. Louise Chaput did not go quietly into the darkness. She fought for her life. But it had not been enough. The investigation that followed was plagued with difficulties from the very beginning. New Hampshire Senior Assistant Attorney General Jeffrey Strelson later explained to reporters, "The area where the murder occurred is out in the woods. Second, there was a significant time lag between the murder and the discovery of Louise's body. At least a week went by. Because of that, the killer or killers essentially had a week's head start on us, and that meant we lost some potential evidence." Louise had been hiking alone, hours from her home in a foreign country. She had no known enemies. No witnesses to the murder ever came forward. The trail she was on wasn't heavily trafficked, especially in mid-November. Whoever killed her had simply vanished into the wilderness. Several items belonging to Louise were never recovered. Her dark blue internal frame backpack with a Canadian flag on the outside, her green down sleeping bag, and the keys to her silver Ford Focus. Her car had been found at the Diratissima trailhead, not far from where her body was discovered. But the missing gear suggested one possible motive: robbery. However, the robbery theory was immediately problematic. The items stolen were of relatively little value and would not have fetched much money. More importantly, the killer never used Louise's credit or bank cards after the murder. The last transaction on record was at the Colebrook convenience store on the day she arrived. Her car was left untouched at the trailhead. If robbery was the motive, why not take the car? Why not use the credit cards? Investigators began to consider a more disturbing possibility. This was a random killing. Someone had encountered Louise on the trail, perhaps at Lost Pond or along one of the connecting paths, and attacked her without provocation or clear motive. According to Canadian crime podcast producer Boris Prue, who covered the case extensively years later, authorities told him they believed it was unlikely that Louise knew her attacker. But who was this person, and why did they kill her? The FBI joined the investigation. The New Hampshire State Police devoted significant resources to the case. They interviewed dozens of people who had been in the area around November 15, 2001. They chased down every lead, no matter how small. They searched for anyone who might have seen something unusual, heard something suspicious, or encountered someone acting strangely on the trails. They found nothing. Years passed. The case grew cold. But Louise's family and friends refused to let her be forgotten. Every year, especially around the anniversary of her murder, they would travel to Pinkham Notch. They would meet with law enforcement, hand out posters, and generate media coverage. Louise's two longtime friends, Denise Masson and Marie Pinault, who were married and lived in Ottawa, became tireless advocates for keeping the case active. Marie Pinault was instrumental in getting the Canadian crime podcast, Syntheses, to produce a 6-part series on Louise's murder. The podcast was very popular in Canada. Louise's daughter, Constance Chaput-Raby, who was only 10 years old when her mother was killed, has spoken publicly about the case multiple times over the years. In 2021, on the 20th anniversary of the murder, she said, "Obviously, we understand that there are other cases, and it's been 20 years. But still, new eyes on the case. Maybe a new detective can see something that people didn't see before or didn't go through. Things can change. There's probably someone knowing something in the area, and as we know, almost every murderer talks about it to someone. It's such a horrible secret to carry." Constance also expressed difficulty talking to her own daughters about how their grandmother died. She said, "I think in English the term closure, which we don't have in French, is very appropriate. You never get your friend back, but at least you know what happened." In the years following the murder, investigators have periodically reached out to the hiking community, asking anyone who was in the White Mountains during that November 2001 weekend to come forward with any information. They've specifically asked hikers to watch for Louise's missing backpack with the Canadian flag insignia, her sleeping bag, and her other missing items. The case remains open with the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit. A reward is still being offered for information leading to an arrest. But, as of now, more than 20 years after Louise Chaput was stabbed to death on a beautiful trail beneath Mount Washington, no one has been arrested. No suspects have been publicly named. No one has been brought to justice. Louise Chaput was a self-employed psychologist who specialized in marital counseling. She helped people work through their problems, heal their relationships, and find happiness. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend. She loved the outdoors and had hiked the White Mountains dozens of times without incident. She was experienced, prepared, and careful. But none of that mattered on November 15th, 2001. Somewhere out there, a killer walks free. Someone who knows what happened on that trail. Someone who was the reason why Louise Chaput had to die. Someone who perhaps has told someone else about what they did. Because as Constance said, almost every murderer talks about it. Case 3. The Death of Scott Lilly. Stonewall's Last Stand. In the world of long-distance hiking, it's common for people to adopt trail names. nicknames that reflect their personality, an inside joke, or something they're passionate about. These names become a hiker's identity on the trail. Fellow hikers often don't know each other by real names, only the personas they've created in the wilderness. When you're walking 2,000 miles with strangers who become family, these trail names matter. Scott Lilly chose the trail name Stonewall. He was a 30-year-old man from South Bend, Indiana, about 5'8", weighing around 150 pounds. Scott was a Civil War history enthusiast, passionate about the battles, the leaders, and the stories of that bloody conflict. His trail name was likely inspired by Thomas Stonewall Jackson, the legendary Confederate general. For Scott, hiking the Appalachian Trail was about more than just completing a physical challenge. It was a journey through history. He planned to visit Civil War battlefields along the way, walking the same ground where soldiers had fought and died more than a century earlier. Scott's sister, Allison Lilly, later described him to reporters. He was a 30-year-old man living out a dream by traveling the Appalachian Trail and visiting Civil War battlefields. He was just excited about it, and I told him that I loved him and to be careful, and he was trying to make us proud. Scott had been introduced to the Appalachian Trail by his childhood minister, Pastor Craig Clapper, an experienced hiker who had spent more than 20 years exploring the trail. Scott had decided to do a section hike rather than a full through hike. He would start in Maryland and hike south to Springer Mountain, Georgia, the trail's southern terminus, completing sections over time rather than all at once. On June 15, 2011, Scott Lilly set out on his adventure. He carried a heavy pack, noticeably heavy for a section hiker, according to other people on the trail. For 6 weeks, everything went according to plan. Scott hiked through Maryland and into Virginia, stopping at shelters along the way, signing the logbooks and meeting fellow hikers. He visited Civil War sites, absorbed the history, and documented his journey. He was living the dream he had told his sister about. The last time anyone saw or heard from Scott Lilly was around July 31st, 2011. He had climbed the Priest, a 4,063-foot mountain in Nelson County, Virginia, where the Appalachian Trail crosses its summit. It's a challenging climb, but Scott made it. He stayed at the Priest shelter, about 0.6 miles east of the AT along the old hotel trail. From there, he likely planned to continue north of the Cow Camp Gap shelter, another 16.8 miles away, about an average day's hike for someone in good condition. The Cow Camp Gap shelter is located slightly off the Appalachian Trail, down the old hotel trail. Many hikers use it as a stopping point before heading into the nearby trail town of Buena Vista, Virginia, for resupply. It's a popular area, well used by both section hikers and through hikers. Scott never made it to Buena Vista. He never checked in with his family after July 31st. But solo hikers sometimes lose track of time or go off-grid for a while, so no one immediately panicked. On Friday morning, August 12, 2011, 12 days after Scott was last seen alive, a group of weekend hikers set out on the old hotel trail in the Mount Pleasant Special Management Area. It was supposed to be a beautiful summer day in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. Instead, they stumbled upon a nightmare. Just off the trail, heading toward Cow Camp Gap shelter, the hikers discovered a body. It was partially buried in a shallow grave, concealed with leaves and debris. The sight was immediately recognizable as something terrible. This wasn't someone who had died from natural causes, nor from an accident. This was a murder. The hikers immediately contacted authorities. Because the body was found on federal land, with the George Washington Jefferson National Forest, the FBI took control of the investigation. Agents from the FBI, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Virginia State Police, and the Amherst County Sheriff's Office all converged on the scene. 4 days later, on August 16, 2011, the body was positively identified as Scott Allen Lilly. The medical examiner's report, released in January 2012, revealed the cause of death: asphyxia by suffocation. Scott had been murdered, suffocated to death by an unknown assailant. Based on the state of decomposition, investigators determined that Scott had been dead for approximately 12 days before his body had been discovered. That placed his time of death around July 31st or August 1st, right around the time he was last seen at the Priest. But who killed him, and why? The FBI launched an extensive investigation, interviewing more than 83 people and collecting over 100 pieces of evidence. They traced Scott's movements through shelter logbooks and talked to every hiker who might have crossed paths with him in the days before his death. They found a few of his belongings, but many items were missing, like his trail shoes, brown and orange low-top Ozark Trail brand from Walmart, his blue or purple backpack, some clothing, his propane stove, an Appalachian Trail handbook, and even a Nintendo handheld game. The missing gear suggested robbery might be a motive, but that theory had problems. Most hikers don't carry valuable items. Everything they own has to fit in a backpack and be carried on their backs for hundreds of miles. The stolen items wouldn't have been worth much money to anyone. Additionally, whoever killed Scott would have had to carry their own heavy backpack plus Scott's gear, which would have been extremely difficult. A day hiker from a nearby town seemed like a more likely suspect than another thru hiker. In September 2011, the FBI released a public statement asking to speak with 5 specific hikers who might have had contact with Scott Lilly around the time of his death. The agency released the hikers' trail names: Mr. Coffee, White Wolf, Papa Smurf, Combat Gizmo, and Space Cadet. The announcement ignited a firestorm on hiking message boards and forums. Hikers began to speculate wildly about the 5 names, particularly Papa Smurf. Multiple people using that trail name had been on the Appalachian Trail that summer, and one of them had a troubled history. He had been arrested before and removed from the trail for disturbing the peace and had been involved in fights in trail towns. Some hikers on the forums began naming this person specifically, suggesting he was a person of interest in Scott's murder. The FBI quickly clarified their statement. According to FBI spokesperson Dee Rybisky, none of the 5 hikers were suspects. There were never any suspects, she explained. There were 3 to 4 different Papa Smurfs out there. It was simply people that we kind of wanted to touch base with. The FBI was merely trying to construct a timeline of Scott's final days and needed to fill the gaps. All 5 hikers were eventually contacted and interviewed, but none were arrested or publicly named as suspects. So, if robbery wasn't the clear motive, and none of the hikers interviewed were suspects, what happened to Scott Lilly? One theory proposed by investigators was that Scott had been the victim of a random attack. Wrong place, wrong time. The Cow Camp Gap shelter area is relatively accessible by road. Someone from the surrounding towns could have hiked the short distance from Wiggins Spring Road, encountered Scott on the trail, and killed him for reasons that might never make sense to anyone else. Perhaps it was a dispute that escalated. Perhaps it was a mentally unstable person acting on impulse. Perhaps it was someone who simply wanted to know what it felt like to kill. Some people suggested hill people, or hillbillies, might have been responsible, a stereotype about Appalachian communities that investigators rejected. Cow Camp Gap is not an isolated location, it's a highly used recreational area, and the idea that backwoods locals were targeting hikers did not match the evidence or the reality of the region. Another disturbing theory was that Scott was targeted, specifically because he was hiking alone. Solo hikers are vulnerable. They have no one to watch their backs, no witnesses if something goes wrong. If Scott's killer was deliberately hunting solitary hikers on the trail, he could have been one victim among several. Some investigators privately believed that Scott's death might be connected to other unsolved cases in the area. In April 2012, hoping to generate new leads, the FBI announced a $10,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Scott's killer. Special Agent Steve Duenas, the lead investigator, held a press conference and revealed additional details about the case, including confirmation that Scott's body had been buried. Duenas appealed to the hiking community, saying, "I have no reason to believe the trail is any more dangerous. Hikers just have to be aware and take all the normal precautions." But for Scott Lilly's family, those precautions came too late. His sister Allison made emotional pleas to the public, begging anyone with information to come forward. "He was trying to make us proud," she repeated in interviews, her voice breaking. "He was living out his dream." Pastor Craig Clapper, the man who had introduced Scott to the Appalachian Trail, was devastated by his death. In honor of Scott, Pastor Clapper completed a full through hike of the Appalachian Trail in 2013 and wrote a spiritual book about his journey called Legging It. He retired from full-time ministry in 2012, and the Appalachian Trail became his way of processing the grief of losing the young man he had mentored. Scott Lilly's funeral was held on August 29, 2011, at Trinity Evangelical Free Church in South Bend, Indiana. Pastor Clapper conducted the service. Scott was survived by his mother Susan, his sister Allison, and his brother Joshua. His father Ted Lilly had preceded him in death. More than a decade has passed since Scott's body was found in that shallow grave near Cow Camp Gap Shelter. Despite the FBI's extensive investigation, despite the interviews, the evidence collection, and the $10,000 reward, no arrests have ever been made. The case remains unsolved. No one has been charged with suffocating Scott Lilly to death and burying his body in the woods. No one has been brought to justice for ending the life of a 30-year-old man who was simply trying to live out his dream of hiking the Appalachian Trail and connecting with American history. Like Louise Chaput, Scott's killer is still out there. Case 4. The Impossible Vanishing of Trini Gibson. On October 8, 1976, 39 students from Bearden High School in Knoxville, Tennessee, boarded a bus for a surprise field trip to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Only one teacher, Wayne Dunlap, supervised the group. The students were instructed to hike 1.8 miles along the Forney Ridge Trail to Andrews Bald, then return to the parking area by 3:30 p.m. Among those students was 16-year-old Teresa Lynn Gibson. Everyone called her Trini. Brown hair, green eyes, 5 foot 3 inches tall. She wore a blue blouse, a borrowed brown plaid jacket, blue jeans, and blue Adidas shoes. And on her finger, a diamond and star sapphire ring she treasured. This wasn't a wilderness expedition. This was a school field trip, the kind that happens thousands of times across America without incident. But this time would be different. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the return hike, multiple students watched Trini stop on the trail and crouch down, as though examining something on the ground. Then she stepped off the trail into the thick brush. Another student came up from behind moments later. They looked back toward where she had stepped off the trail. She was gone. They called her name. No response. When the bus prepared to depart at 3:40 p.m., Trini wasn't there. Teacher Wayne Dunlap contacted park rangers at 4:30 p.m. What followed was one of the most extensive search operations in Great Smoky Mountains history. 756 people participated: park rangers, National Guard personnel, volunteers, bloodhounds, German shepherds, and helicopters. The search continued for 2 weeks, but no trace of Trini was found. Trini's father organized a second massive search in April and May of 1977 with 230 additional volunteers. Again, nothing. Then there was a third search in 1981, but it was also unsuccessful. But here's where the case becomes truly disturbing. 3 tracking dogs picked up Trini's scent and followed it to the intersection with the Appalachian Trail, past Klingman's Dome Tower, and along the roadside for approximately 1.5 miles from Newfound Gap. Then the scent vanished completely, as though Trini had simply ceased to exist at that exact spot along the road. This strongly suggests she got into a vehicle. Someone had been waiting for her. The next day, investigators found 8 cigarette butts of the same brand near the roadside location where the dogs lost her scent. 3 cigarette butts and a partially consumed beer can were also found near the spot where she had stepped off the trail. But Trini didn't smoke, and Trini didn't drink. The case took strange turns. After Trini disappeared, her large Stanley comb, which friends said she was never without, mysteriously appeared on the dashboard of classmate Robert Simpson's car. He claimed she had given it to him to keep. Her expensive star sapphire pendant and ring were later found in possession of another student, who could not satisfactorily explain how she obtained them. Robert Simpson was 17, a friend of Trini's older brother. Trini had been wearing his jacket that day. He was the last person confirmed to spend significant time with her. He claimed he went tracking a bear after she left him. He made an odd statement to Trini's sister. If Kelvin Bowman has Trini, he will kill her. If he doesn't have her, I think she might run off with some horny hitchhiker. Kelvin Bowman was another person of interest. In October of 1975, he had allegedly tried to break into the Gibson home. Trini's mother shot him in the foot. Bowman reportedly made threats in court to harm Trini when released. He served only 6 months of a 2-year sentence and was back at school by October 1976. The principal stated Bowman was in class the day Trini disappeared, but some students claimed he followed the bus to the mountains. Despite these leads, no arrests were ever made. The FBI investigated, but their files have never been released. Unusual for a nearly 50-year-old unsolved case. The park chief ranger told reporters he was almost sure she was not in the park, an extraordinary statement suggesting law enforcement believed she was abducted, not lost. The tragedy destroyed Trini's family. Her parents divorced. Her brother Robert Jr. died in 2000 at age 42. Her father Robert Sr. died in 2004 at age 67. Her sister Tina died in 2016 at age 54. Trini Gibson stepped off the Forney Ridge Trail in broad daylight on a well-traveled path with dozens of other hikers nearby, only half a mile from a parking lot. She vanished in seconds. Multiple students saw her step into the brush, and moments later, she was gone. Tracking dogs followed her scent 1.5 miles to a roadside where it disappeared completely, with cigarette butts left by someone who had been waiting. And then her possessions mysteriously appeared in some classmates' hands weeks later. Was she abducted by Robert Simpson, or by Kelvin Bowman, or by some stranger waiting in the woods? Did someone follow the school bus from Knoxville? For 48 years, those questions have haunted the Smoky Mountains. Trini would have been 64 years old today. Maybe she is, if she's still out there. Case 5. The Survivalist Paradox. The Disappearance of Derek Luking. 24-year-old Derek Joseph Luking was obsessed with Man vs. Wild, the television show where Bear Grylls survives in extreme environments with minimal equipment. Derek went by Drock or DJ, and he had brown hair and green eyes, was 5'11", and weighed 220 pounds, with a distinctive tattoo on his left upper chest, Japanese characters meaning live or life. He was a Johnson University graduate who worked as an orderly at Peninsula Behavioral Health Center in Louisville, Tennessee. Derek wasn't an experienced outdoorsman, but he was a huge Bear Grylls fan, and according to his family, he had been increasingly unhappy with his life. He didn't like his job. He felt directionless. He had started drinking and smoking cigarettes, highly unusual behavior for him. On March 14th, 2012, Derek vanished from his Louisville home. What happened over the next 3 days would create one of the most baffling mysteries in Appalachian Trail history. Over 3 days, Derek visited Bass Pro Shop, Knife Works, Coleman's, and Walmart, purchasing over $1,000 in survival equipment. a Gerber pack axe, Bear Grylls survival tool pack, military survival manual pages, knife sharpener, compass and thermometer, 100 feet of parachute cord, headlamp, pocket knife, granola bars, iPod Touch, tint, sleeping bag, and maps. This was not random shopping. This was a planned survival expedition. Everything was functional, practical, designed for wilderness survival, with perhaps some exception to the iPod Touch. He checked into a Motel 6 on March 14th. He stayed at Smokemont Campground inside Great Smoky Mountains National Park on March 15th. He then checked into the Microtel Hotel in Cherokee, North Carolina on March 16th. Staff later found a Bible on the bed and an empty bottle of liquor on the floor. At 4 a.m. on March 17th, security cameras captured Derek leaving the Microtel alone, wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt, dark track pants with white stripe, and dark sneakers. He carried only a small, dark day pack, not the large backpack filled with survival gear. At 8:30 a.m., rangers found Derek's white Ford Escape at Newfound Gap, one of the most popular overlooks in the park, where the Appalachian Trail crosses Newfound Gap Road. Inside the car, all of Derek's expensive survival gear was there, along with his wallet, his cash, his car keys, and there was a handwritten note. It read, "Don't try to follow me." This note wasn't addressed to anyone, just a statement, a warning, or maybe a plea. March 17th was a beautiful Saturday. Sunny and mild, it was perfect hiking weather. Newfound Gap is the busiest area of the park. The parking lot was crowded, and the trails were full. Dozens if not hundreds of people were there that morning. Despite extensive interviews, absolutely no one reported seeing Derek. Park spokesman Bob Miller called this the most disturbing thing about the case. Rangers told reporters, "There was a ton of people in the park that day. It was a nice day. Does it mean he got off the trail right away? Maybe." The complete absence of witnesses suggested Derek either immediately entered dense forest where no one would see him, or deliberately avoided people, hiding when hikers approached, moving through wilderness like a ghost. Ranger Jim Traynor said, "We would have felt better if he had bought all this gear and brought it with him." The abandoned equipment suggested a sudden change of plans, or something far more ominous. March 17th was the first anniversary of his grandfather's death, someone Derek was very close to. His father, Tim Luking, noticed behavioral changes earlier that year. When rangers asked if Derek might take his own life, Tim responded, "Up until now, I would have said absolutely not. But in the circumstances, there was that possibility." Approximately 60 searchers and 3 dog teams were deployed. 14 search teams walked over 70 miles of trails. Helicopters searched day and night. Rangers rappelled down cliffs and volunteers distributed 3,000 flyers. Family and friends personally hiked approximately 175 miles of trail combined. They found absolutely nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no blood, no camping gear, no sign Derek Luking had ever set foot in the wilderness. And then came the disturbing coincidence. 23-year-old Michael Giovanni Coccini from Nashville disappeared in the exact same area at almost the exact same time, last seen March 18th, only a day after Derek vanished. His car was found March 20th near Newfound Gap. Searches for both men were conducted simultaneously. Both young, both disappearing within days of each other, and both in the same small park section. Months later, human remains were found. DNA confirmed they belonged to Michael Coccini, but Derek Luking was never found. So, what happened? One theory is that Derek attempted a Bear Grylls-style survival challenge, leaving gear behind to test himself with minimal equipment. But again, he was not an experienced outdoorsman. Theory and practice are different. This plan would be extraordinarily reckless. Another theory was suicide. The anniversary of his grandfather's death, behavioral changes, the cryptic note, the Bible in the hotel room all support this. But if Derek planned to take his own life, why spend $1,000 on survival gear? Why prepare so meticulously? And where is his body? Theory 3. It was an accident. Perhaps he went to scout trails, planning to return for gear, but got lost, injured, or disoriented. The Smokies contain dense wilderness and thick rhododendron that can conceal remains for decades. But searchers should have found something by now. Blood or torn clothing, some trace. Another theory: foul play. The connection to Cochini's disappearance is deeply troubling. Two young men, similar in age and in the same area in the same week. One was found dead, and the other wasn't found. Could someone have forced Derek off trail and made him write that note? Derek Luking has been missing for 12 years. He would be 36 years old today. His family maintains a Find Derek Luking Facebook page, and the case remains open. Thanks for listening. This episode seriously messed with me, with all the usual narration I do of strange creatures or mysterious spirits and whatnot. Hearing about people just going about their business, seemingly killed for no reason, people disappearing forever when so close to the trail. It terrifies me that the normal everyday things around me, the roads I walk on and the people I pass by, could become the very reasons why I might never be seen alive again. Good night. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and you can follow me on X at Dark Prevails. Check out my other shows on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. I host Tales from the Break Room, where I narrate allegedly true scary stories that happen at work, and Alone in the Woods, where I narrate allegedly true scary stories that happened in the wilderness specifically. Don't forget, if you're on YouTube, subscribe and leave a like. If you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app, leave me a follow and a rating or review. Thank you. Until next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.